Hey, folks, welcome. This is a conversation that was sparked on the Theory of Knowledge Society list. And we've had a lot of back and forth on that, and that raised a bunch of topics that Andrea is going to take us through. So I'm Greg, and I'll be offering my version of the unified theory. I'm sure folks watching this will be familiar with me, but I want to just also introduce Andrea and Nick. Andrea?
Okay, so I am an Italian psychologist, and I recently passed the exam state in order to become a licensed psychologist. So I think thank you. My main academic scientific interests lie in evolutionary psychology and also philosophy of science, and that's the reason why I reached out to Greg, I think last May, the May of 2020. And so I became gradually more and more interested in the theory of knowledge, in the tree of knowledge, and in the garden of Utua. Okay. Yeah. And so I think the main topics we are going to debate today are at least the topics that interest me the most are the relationship between the empirical evidence and the theoretical coincidence upon which the TOK system is built. And so, yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that I'm looking forward. I'd like to frame this as based on my friend John Vervaeke's concept of dialogos. Okay, so this is serious conversation in authentic relation, trying to get at a deeper understanding of the world. So certainly that can involve obviously debate and disagreement, but it is also, I think, really structured to cultivate both relationship, empathetic understanding, broadening of horizons, and all that good stuff, which is, I like that flavor of academic exploration. It's not always the tenor of academic exploration.
No.
I'd like us to increase that tenor. So that's, I'm expanding, I'm trying to build off of John's version and trying to have this grow. So I'd like that to be our flavor. So Nick?
Yeah, so I am Nick Latanzio. Like Andrea, I'm not a psychologist yet. I can't call myself one, unfortunately, but I do have my doctorates in clinical psychology. I'm doing my postdoc right now, so hopefully I'll be a psychologist within like a year. I am obviously very interested in applied psychology, but very much in different philosophies as well. My philosophical roots kind of go back to Alan Watts. Aldous Huxley was a big influence. Ram Dass is a huge influence. I got a picture of him over there. And then you'll see me throughout this podcast or whatever it is we're doing here that I'm focusing over to my right. That's because I got an 8-month-old Maine Coon kitten, which is like a regular sized cat. His name is Ram Dass, and I'm trying to allow him to be in here, but I may escort him out should he become a disturbance.
Perfect. Okay. So are you doing your pre-doc or your postdoc now?
Postdoc. So I'm done with school. It's just the state requirements I have to meet.
Gotcha. So you're not a licensed psychologist, but I think you're an actual psychologist, right? Though.
Well, I don't know. I was told I can't call myself a psychologist until I'm licensed.
Right. Well, actually, in some ways, you can't call yourself a psychologist if you're a professor of psychology. So that's the licensing people try to hold that label in weird ways. So I will say that to me, you're a psychologist, Nick.
I appreciate that so much. I've been waiting to hear that for.
You've been waiting to hear that for a long time. I will confer that title on you by virtue of my membership in the committee, and I will.
I'm knighted. That's great.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, Andrea, you prepared a wide variety of different topics, and so you'll be sort of you'll be the topic raiser, and then we'll enter into the doorway that way and see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah. So okay, I'm taking the list. Okay, so my main concerns are about how TOK system, okay, can be based on empirical evidence, or
Yep.
how much we can say it is theoretical consilient, okay. And
Yep.
so what is the very difference between empirical evidence and
Yep.
theoretical consilience? And so I was wondering if in the other sciences, especially in the so-called harder sciences, are there any basic behavioral or descriptive units, for example, cell, gene, particle, physical particles, if they have been acknowledged as such, okay, only because they were theoretical consistent with the evidence, or do they always need empirical evidence per se? I don't know if I made myself clear, but
yeah, no, you made
okay.
yourself clear. Yeah, so this is a great question, okay, and certainly gives rise to a wide variety of different issues relative to my system, okay. So let's talk about let's just use the Thomas Kuhn frame of normal science.
Yeah.
Okay. And so normal science basically is you are raised in the context of a paradigm. All right. The paradigm then has subsets of theories underneath that provide some causal explanatory framework. You then are interested in both the theory and then some phenomena that relates to the paradigm and the theory, okay? You're then placed in a particular program of research, and then your task as a novel researcher essentially is to say, well, what aspect has not really been investigated in relation, and therefore what hypothesis can I generate that then will be quantifiable in some set of variable relations that either is going to use some sort of descriptive analysis or experimental analysis or quasi-experimental analysis that will then feed back on and be then the empirical architecture of the data and information that then legitimizes or not the hypothesis and the theory. Okay? Is that
right there? Is that, did you basically just describe the problem of psychology, or am I mistaken?
No, right. I'm describing just normal science. That's what I'm describing.
But I mean, that sounds to me a lot like what the problem of psychology actually is.
Okay, well, my argument about what the problem of psychology is that when we look at, I'll put it this way, when we look at biology, let's see what happened in relationship to biology with this model, okay? So biology and physics, biology, chemistry, and physics, okay, are paradigmatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I mean by that is that there are massive paradigms that are relatively well interrelated, and there's agreement at least about their interrelation. Okay.
Yeah.
So for example, that's not always been the case, of course. Okay. Modern science has evolved and these elements have evolved, right? Okay. So we can make a couple of different steps. You can have the pre-Darwin biology, which is basically trying to just get a taxonomy of the various kinds of species, okay? Then Darwin comes along, and with natural selection, although there are lots of different variants of evolution, but Darwin's natural selection and Wallace's natural selection provides a degree of continuity in the material universe and a mechanistic causal feedback loop that then places the process by which these species could have emerged in the natural context. And that becomes a key piece of the puzzle, okay? For the biological science to be anchored to the rest of science and to create a naturalistic picture, all right? So biology does not get paradigmatic with Darwin himself. It just starts to become. The reason is because there's also genetics, okay? And there's also cell theory. Cell theory then, as before Darwin, but basically the idea, it's along these lines, the idea that, oh my gosh, all of life is organized into these units of cells that perform the fundamental structure, functional structural organization of life is the cell. That's cell theory, okay? And then you also have genetics. So Mendelian genetics he doesn't, nobody knows about him at first. He's actually, he's a contemporary of Darwin, but he's a little monk isolated, but he does all these pea pod experiments. 30 years after he does them, right before the 20th century, they're rediscovered, and a number of people start to then identify genetics as an intergenerational inherited model, okay, for how shit's inherited over time.
There is also a fun fact about that Mendel wrote to Darwin, but Darwin never answered to.
That's right. Hey, actually, I think they found his. Then they find Mendel's manuscript unopened in Darwin's shit. You know, so that's a nice little backstory about what could have happened. So that's, you know, that's like 1870s, okay, and then really it's the 19th century that you start to really get experimental genetics gets reactivated and then part of the mainstream public institutional mechanisms, and they start doing experiments on genes and inheritance, and they start looking at the various processes and really rediscover Mendel and start to break it into the structure of biological understanding, okay? And they thought that the genes would create these massive mutations. And in the 1920s, there was a big dispute between the mutationists, okay, genetic experimental mutation, like that there's macro level changes because weird genes happen, and that's how things are going to evolve, versus the naturalists that say, no, it's much more gradual variation, selection, and retention in nature. There's not these gigantic jumps. And there wasn't a really good way to come along and merge them, okay? Then what happens is a couple of mathematical, statistical, biological people, R.A. Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and a few other people started to generate a way to describe what's called population genetics, which is the frequencies of genes in various populations and how they would evolve over time, and how natural selection would serve as this filter so that natural selection operates on the frequencies of population genetics, which then builds cells and organisms. And it's the process of building those cells and organisms that you get the phenotype upon which natural selection operates, okay? This is what's called the unification of biology, all right? Whereby natural selection operating on genetic combinations to produce a genotype that then expresses itself in a phenotype, and then that gets operated on as a function of selection, is the great unification of biology that happens in the 1930s and 40s, okay? So that biology, the modern evolutionary synthesis, becomes a paradigm of biology. It's really best conceptualized in our term as a meta paradigm, because you had mid-level paradigms of various evolutionary, Lamarckian and natural selection. You had different kinds of genetics. You had cell theory, and they weren't intersecting. It was pre-paradigmatic, okay? Then you get those big systems fused together to then create an interlocking meta theory, meaning that there are these different theories that now can be seen to be placed together to create a much more holistic set that then enables the entire field to have consensus, essentially, about what the heart of biology is. It's the transition from the dimension of matter to life. The fundamental unit is the cell at the organizational level. The gene's a fundamental unit of information, and natural selection creates an evolutionary process that gives us the tree of life. Okay. And then boom, now you have the organization and unification of biology. Now I will say that a lot of people, that there are a couple of missing pieces that are now more salient, and there are models that say about biology that this doesn't quite work. And the modern evolutionary synthesis is an outline that has holes in it. So itself as a paradigm is wobbling, but it crystal clear is a paradigm. And what you get then is the synthesis of different mid-level paradigms into a meta level, okay? And then what you also get is a clear delineation of the subject matter of life. Although there's debates about exactly what life is, the dimension of life corresponds to biological science. Nobody debates whether biology is the science of life, and no one really debates as to whether or not it's at least somewhat conciliant with the physical, chemical sciences. So, and then that becomes STEM itself. It gets placed on the natural sciences. And now you have STEM, the STEM sciences, the science version of them. There's math and engineering, but your science version is physics, chemistry, biology, and domains along those lines. And they are then paradigmatic, or really meta paradigmatic, because they have meta theories.
Yeah.
and metaphysical descriptions of their subject matter that create a consensus. Okay, that's the deal. All right. Now, that's the level of analysis that I'm operating off of when I'm doing my meta. When I'm now going to bring a meta philosophical view, okay, that's been really coming up from. I'm going to look at not so much the landscape of empirical data, but I'm going to look at the landscape of paradigms. Okay, and this becomes complicated in terms of what do we mean by empirical. So I'm going to organize the paradigms and the way they organize their theories and the way they organize all of their empirical research. Okay, so I'm going to take each one of these as units, all right, and then I'm going to look at their interrelation as units, and I'm going to look at them and say, hey, there is no paradigm for meta paradigm for psychology. That's the first point. That, by the way, is what I mean when I say the problem of psychology is that it's like biology was before its unification. Okay, it has all of these paradigms, but there's no meta-paradigmatic consensual unification, and so it just bounces around. And in fact, what psychology then did is it did a weak unification of 90% of it around cognitive. Okay, so they said, hey, the nervous system is an information processing system. 90% of psychology buys that. The radical behaviors are 5 to 10 that percent say, no, that's epistemologically or ontologically wrong. We don't buy that. So they never get integrated. But so there's still radical behaviors that are 5 to 10% of the population. But 95%, the other 95 said, yes, we can infer that the nervous system is an information processing system. We then debate about there's no paradigm of that, but we agree on that level of agreement. And then we jump over and we say, we apply the empirical behavioral science research methods to link and then measure and extract our understanding from that. That's what psychology has, which I call the eclectic empiricism of psychology. And that's what the science of psychology at 101 level became. And then there's that, okay? And then what happened is that there became consensual agreement that there would be no meta paradigm, okay?
Yeah.
That you could not, you couldn't. They decided, there wasn't any hunt for it. There was a shared set of agreements that basically amongst the institution that said any meta paradigm is flawed from the beginning. And they then double down on particular research paradigms. That's the identity of psychologists to apply the research empiricism. That's why I call them empirical psychologists.
Yeah. I remember a paper by Koch published, I think, in 1983. And he reached the conclusion that you can call that psychology isn't a proper name for the discipline and science, and you have to call them psychological studies. So
that's exactly right. From every day since its presumptive finding, this is the Sigmund Koch quote, on every day since the trend has not been towards unification, but it's been towards fragmentation and differentiation. The only proper term for this concept is psychological studies. And you should call it studies because you shouldn't lie and say it's a science, because actually the real sciences have some degree of consensual agreement with the definitional terms, the macro level theories, and the organization of the findings to give rise to consilient view, at least at some generalized level. There's always debate, there's always differentiation, there's not, and there's never a monologue in science about what every truth is. But and we go to physics, you have quantum mechanics and general relativity and Newtonian mechanics and a few other pieces, but those big three give you a very similar kind of unification that natural selection, genetics, and cell theory give. The psychological shit is psychological studies, okay? And that's the, and there it is. That's the current status of the field. And the question then is why? Or what is it about the world that makes that happen, okay? And I find that to be a super fascinating question. I fell into that world. I was like, why is it that we can develop consilience at the level up to biology and then in a little bit into neuroscience to the extent that it's anchored to that understanding, and then we get into psychology and maybe ethology, but ethology blends into comparative psychology, and there's just a complete paradigmatic breakdown of into pluralism in a fundamentally qualitatively different way. So that's the problem of psychology. Why does that happen? And by the way, I want to be clear. I mean psychology as the branch of science So it's the language game it is playing. Mike and I can talk about this, but the language game of modern psychology is to try to jam it into the natural science language game. That's its identity. Okay. If you're going to say no, it doesn't play by the language game of natural science, then I'm going to be like, why call it psychology? Okay, it's like there's all these other disciplines that don't fucking play by the natural game of science. They go back further. You know, there's the humanities. There's 6,000 different ways of thinking about stuff. To me, I want to say that there's psychology before natural science, which basically is philosophy. And I want to say meta psychology looks at that. Philosophy of mind, you know, ethics, how do we live? All these basic questions go back to basically philosophy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, but modern science is about, hey, there's experimentation, quantification, blind studies, any other number of methods. And then modern science of psychology is trying to jam the questions that we have about whatever mind and behavior is into the language game of natural science. And the funny thing is that breaks down. That's weird. Why does it break down there? Okay. And not only that, it's broken down for so long with so much chaos that the consensus is it has to break down, basically. And so what you really do is you play by the method game, even if you can't generate the knowledge system, you play by the method game. And of course, you play by the methods, and lots of people yield very interesting studies. I mean, I was fascinated my entire undergraduate. I was in love with it because there's one study after another study would yield angles and information. And I was like, felt like I was learning shit. And I was definitely in the field just learning shit, you know?
The issue is we because we don't have that broader structure, is we don't know what we're missing with all of these things that we found. It's kind of just a bunch of almost sporadic random findings, like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's effective, that's nice, but we don't know what we're missing. We're probably missing those connections that, if I understand what you've been talking about, right, with emergent properties, we might be missing out on some of those.
Oh my God. Here's what so when I'm in academic school, I'm learning each one of these studies. They'll do these studies, and then I'm, you know, as an undergrad, it's like, oh, great, okay. But then what happens, and I know this, you know, I don't know how much practice stuff you do, Andrea, but you know, if you got licensed, you do at least some, and obviously I know Nick does. So I move into the therapy room, right?
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden you're in the therapy room, you have a real person in front of you, right? And a real relation. It's not theoretical anymore.
That's a different shit.
Person there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's like, holy shit. And your task is to do something to make things better at some level, right? I mean, that's why you're there. Or else if you can't do anything to make it better, get the fuck out of there and get somebody in there that can. That's what you're there to cultivate some sort of well-being and mitigate suffering in some way. I mean, that's why you're a health professional, right? And it's real. It's not theoretical anymore. Okay. So then you've got a couple of options, though. I'm trained as a scientist, okay? So it gets grilled into me. I'm an empiricist, you know, be skeptical of your own impressions, right? Go with the data, okay? And then I come through the CBT line because I used to believe that actually meant something. You know, that was like, oh, they're grounded. You know, we didn't do Freudian bullshit. We actually do real science, you know? I bought that line. You know, I'm ashamed to say, I'm sorry, I bought that fucking line. And then, you know, but then I watch, and then I have some really interesting experiences in my own training. I find a rigid CBTer who's trying to jam me into particular things, and I'm immediately turned off by that. And I actually get this existential African humanistic woman who's like just brilliant. I mean, she just knows how to dance with me instantaneously in the room, and then open my eyes to all this other stuff. And I'm like, you know, maybe my understanding is a little more complicated, right? What's the empirical evidence that she'd be so much better than this other rigid, clueless woman, okay? And then what you have is, you see, and I'm sure you guys do, each one of these tunes speaks a brilliant language when it's danced well. So you see family systems people, oh my God, that person's really good. Then you see other people apply it shitty, and you're like, oh, they're late. So it's, each of them have brilliance, and then when they're sung well by the right person, you see that and you appreciate it. That's what I saw. Okay. And my master's program, I was very fortunate. They had a psychotherapy integration sensibility. And I had a couple that were really well skilled and brought in other people's and respected each of the school and said, hey, when it's done well, each of these have things to offer. Okay. And what that did then is that created awareness of the paradigm problem that I hadn't really appreciated in the past, because it's like, now I'm like, wait a minute, I want to apply the best paradigm, okay? And then I get the intersection between my feminist and feminine therapy heart and my physicist and masculine head. Okay?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is basically like, well, family systems operates at a different level than individual. Cognitive is focused on my justification. Psychodynamics, my, deep, dark shit. I'm looking at behaviorism put in the environment. They're all aspects. And yet at the same time, when you back up and you see what the assumptions and justifications are, then they are definitely playing off of different sheets of music. Okay. But if they each are seeing something and you have the idea, and this could be wrong, and this is where Mike Mascola and I somewhat disagree. If you have the idea, this makes me more like Lee Beaumont than Mike. If you have the idea that there's an elephant out there, okay, this is the elephant, and that what the paradigms are seen are different aspects, but I have the Ionian enchantment, which means I'm a consilient coherentist of reality. It's like, oh, we're seeing different aspects of the elephant. There should be a map of the whole elephant.
Yeah,
okay,
definitely. Yeah.
And if there's a map of the whole elephant, I want that map so that then I can know how to make the noise. So right now it feels like I hear the music of each of the instruments, but when I jam them together, it's noise. If I have the entire sheet music and see the elephant, I can sing the entire song, and I know how to effectively correspond the family therapist, the behaviorist, the cognitivist, the humanist, and the psychodynamic person with psychiatry in a coherent picture of harmony. That's the problem of psychotherapy.
Yeah.
That activated me into the search. And then I really then looked over and said, and no one else in the world's ever done this, which is really interesting. There's a psychotherapy problem. And then the question is, well, shouldn't psychotherapy be anchored to the science of human psychology? Okay. The only way it's anchored, on all the R1, it's not anchored through the theory. It's all anchored through empiricism. It's all by research. They mean, what are the findings, which are the library of fucking findings. And I see, and I still contend, you cannot ground the reality of practice in a chaos of findings without a architecture of theory. Theory is the bridge between the specific research and my practice. In other words, I have to assimilate, integrate, and cohere the findings so that I can bring all of that into the unique particular of practice.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the problem of psychology into the problem of psychotherapy and the problem of psychology. And now the issue is, now I have my physicist head is like, well, why the fuck are there all these different paradigms? And why? And then I see evolutionary psychology. I got sucked into evolutionary psychology, and I idealized, rightfully, what happened to the unification of biology. Okay, so then I learned about evolutionary biology and saw just the narrative I gave you. It's like, oh my God, you had Darwin's theory, you had genetics, you had cell theory. There's a unification of biology that happens in the 1940s. Holy shit. And now we can just extend that evolutionary, cosmic evolutionary view from cells and plants into animals and into primates. And that's what the evolutionary view is. And I was enamored with that initially in 1995. It's like, oh my God. And everybody believes kind of in evolution. The different ways, but Rogers, Freud, Skinner, and the family systems theory, they're all scientists. They believe in evolution. So I know we're getting back to this whole empirical question, but it's crucial to help the levels of analysis across, that's the whole metaphysical empirical continuum.
Yeah.
This is a big deal in terms of whether or not we're going to apply the standard scientific meaning of empiricism and where. Okay. And I say scientific meaning of empiricism. All right. There is a empiricism changes its meaning. Okay. There's a first person version of empiricism. David Hume, by empiricism, he means, oh shit, stuff comes through my senses and I qualitatively experience it. That's what I mean by empirical.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then science comes along and says, no, they mean third person empirical, which is quantifiable through experimentation, so that you say, hey, antibiotics work. How the fuck do I know I don't know that antibiotics works. I can't see anything. You open up the double blind trials and then you look at the quantifiable data and you say, there's your empirical evidence. It doesn't matter what you see. We now have third person quantifiable stuff. Notice it's completely different from first person experiences. Now the methods of science allow us to elucidate these objective empirical claims, which are completely removed from our subjective experience. I mean, it's like, I don't know what, I just look at the data and then say, oh, no, so that's a huge shift. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's crucial at multiple levels. Crucial. Like, look at this conversation. This conversation is meaningless at the level of third person quantifiable empiricism, but at a first person level, it's like, man, this fucking makes sense. Making sense makes a big deal. And when you do therapy, it's like, what else do you have but to kind of make sense of the shit in the world? So these are, those are very, there are lots of, then we can then break, that's the backdrop. What I am after then is meta-theoretical, initially, meta-paradigm consilience. If you get meta-paradigm consilience, then you basically ask the question at the meta-theoretical level. It's like, well, how? Why? How do you make professional judgments about how consilient is? You can then ask questions, is it really useful to apply? That's a complicated set of questions, but that's basically, it is an opinion and intellectual argument initially, okay? I then shift, I add a couple of pieces to that, and then I add a couple of pieces then that shift the argument from an intellectual opinion argument to an analytical argument, okay? And this is what I will get frustrated about. I'll make an analytical argument. The analytical argument is in the terms of the Enlightenment in science, logical coherence and interconnection is part of the game. You have logic and evidence. That's part of the fucking game, okay? It's not just data, it's data that makes sense and then coheres to best explanation given your understanding. Everyone agrees that it's logic and evidence. Even the fucking positivists had logic and evidence, yet alone psychological interpretation of what all that might mean from alternative explanations. But everyone agrees that it's both that. Theories, facts are theory laden, okay? So in the terms of science itself is a requirement for the conceptual architecture of understanding and its logical coherence inside itself, as well as that's called the coherence argument versus the correspondence argument, which is how well does it map up to the external thing it's trying to map and measure through your experimental data, okay?
That's where the non-dual part of me is just screaming, we don't know anything.
Right, well, but the science plays by a totally different epistemological rule, right? And it will weigh off that rule, because obviously if you then turn in and say, well, we haven't found anything in science, then you sound like an idiot, in danger, right? At the level of to then say that would either then, to me, I appreciate we're playing different epistemological rules, and it's very important to know what game we're playing. So I respect if you jump into first person epistemology and allow that grounding, then that's a reasonable position to take, right?
It's just a totally different direction.
Totally different direction.
Yep.
Inside the science, which already is committed to third person objectivism, okay? And it has an epistemological backing at multiple levels, meaning that they discovered shit. I think that's certainly within its own game. And you look around and you say, to make the claim that science didn't discover anything about reality would be a weird claim to make, in my opinion. So anyway, but inside the realm, I'm playing the game of science. That's why I'm completely a scientist, okay? All I'm saying is that the breakdown happens first at the level of this logic paradigm model, because there's different games. You can then ask a meta-paradigmatic question. That becomes an issue of opinion, okay? And then I was developing a system that said, hey, my system is better in your coordinating. I think that's an initial opinion debate. Okay, you can say, well, Ken Wilber coordinated it a different way. Developmental systems theories coordinated a different way. You always have this different issue at the meta-theoretical level. Okay, well, fair enough. But now what I am arguing, when I'm in my current book, The Problem of Psychology and Its Solution, okay, I have completely honed into what is the problem at the level of logical coherence. Okay, there's a logical coherence problem that's embedded in this that I am now fully identified. At least that's my argument. And I can show you exactly where the logic breaks down, why it breaks down in the Enlightenment, okay, and now how to fix it. And then once all those pieces fall on, it's like a math problem, okay? It's like, you're making a logical argument. The Euler identity is proven, e to the pi I, -1 equals 0. You don't need to go out and say, well, what's the evidence for that? You say, well, here's the architecture of the meaning of the natural log constant, pi, exponential, here you go. And then you have a unit circle, and then you go around the unit circle, and boom, you see that at that point, where everything falls, the proof is there. There's no more, you can look for your other proofs, and it might be interesting. There's no more evidence that you need, okay? So my argument is that the problem of psychology, there's a descriptive metaphysical argument that I'm making that lines up very, very clearly. It's actually layered on top of the meta-theoretical argument. So there's that. And that's the tree of knowledge offers a descriptive metaphysics that solves the Enlightenment gap and clarifies what was the paradigmatic crisis, and then now gives you a definitional set to play the game. And no one had figured that. Already everyone agrees this was a game no one figured out how to play. So that's one set of the arguments, okay? That's at the whole system level of the descriptive metaphysics, and it's the logic of the Enlightenment gap and the problem of psychology, which I could go through if we wanted. But there's a logical set of arguments there that exist at the level of coherence, and to ask like hypothesis empirical database questions about it, that's it's logic game. It's not a predictive evidence game. It's here you go. And then we could go walk through that. To me, this thing gets more interesting if we move over to something like behavioral investment theory and justification systems theory and matrix about certain evidence, and we can explore that. Those things are definitely much closer to the kinds of predictive hypotheses, and they raise all sorts of different kinds of questions for the fine tuning of those claims. But those are meta theories, so it's going to move you more towards the empirical. The descriptive metaphysics really is a definitional vocabulary game.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I talked a lot there. I'll shut up for a while.
Yeah. I think that one of the main problems is that going up through the so-called hierarchy of sciences, so physics, biology, psychology, and so on.
Yep.
The gap between the data and the theory becomes more and more wider, because there is a Estonian epistemologist, his name is Tumela, that says that in disciplines like biology or physics, you have a better material anchor. Okay, you can say a chromosome, you can say the structure of the DNA, and so on and so on. While when you are in psychology or in social sciences, you cannot directly see what you are talking about. So it is less evident, and the data speak less from themselves.
Yeah, I think that certainly there's some truth to that. I believe that, and this I replied back to you and Waldemar and things like that. I believe that it will depend a lot on what your question is, okay? And so it's not like there's in other words, there's a huge amount of vague questions in both physics and biology, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay, so like if you're going to study ecology in biology, I know a couple of ecological friends, environmental science, ecological friends. If you drop that under, that's going to be between earth science and biology and shit like that. But you start asking questions about ecology, they're way the hell out there in terms of their variance and the abstraction, the number of variables and all of that, okay? And if I then say, hey, actually, I'll tell you what I think basic psychology is, okay? Basic psychology refers to the behavior of the animal as a whole, mediated by the nervous system. And we can bring that stuff into the lab, and if you do a cognitive behavioral neuro assessment of a rat in a lab, the shit we know about how rats make decisions and choice points at a maze is amazing. It's just unbelievable, the level of precision that we can get in those kinds of things. So it depends a lot on, it's not just like, oh, they have clean questions and they get clean answers, and then all of a sudden things go to shit. Everything really depends. I am arguing, yes, I agree with that general trend, okay? But it's also the case that things go qualitatively to shit at the consensual understanding level, okay? Yeah. And that's really where I'm trying to focus all of our attention, or at least the attention from the TOK. And because if we get consensual understanding about our terms in these areas, Okay, we get a shared vocabulary going. The level that we can then clarify, well, what's really hard to know, like ecology, you may have all your, I mean, meteorologists have all their terms, but you know, my wife was just saying, hey, they were saying nothing, no snow was coming, and then 6 hours later we're going to get 4 inches, you know, on Sunday night, and then God only knows what we're actually going to get. Right? I mean, like, you know, that's just material process, but because there are all these complex interacting systems, it's a very, very hard thing to predict. So every system's going to have that, all the 3 levels of complexity. If the question involves that kind of process, is going to have enormous ambiguity in its capacity to make predictions. That's always going to be an issue. The higher you go, the more complex variation that you're going to try to account for, and the more error you're going to get, and the more ambiguity. So that's the trend, and that's absolutely right in my view. My view also is that the problem of psychology is huge, so we don't know what our terms are. What do you mean by behavior and mental process? Okay, that's what I mean. Another way, at the subject matter level, what do you mean by behavior and mental process? Okay, and that's horrifying that we don't know the difference. You know, there's a fundamental difference between physical and mental behavior that the behavior is grossly overlooked, and then they got trapped in that, and then they just went with behavior, and that was a huge fucking mistake. If they had gone with mental behavior, we would have been in a much better space. Okay. And if we understood that there's one definition of mind on the inside is neurocognition, another is subjective experience, another is justification. Those are all different domains, and they engage in different interfaces. If all of us had that frame, if Vygotsky had come along and said, here's the crisis, and here we solve it in 1927, you know, like if he and Vygotsky and Henricus were together in 1927, we might have, you know, everything might have worked out okay. You know, at least that's my argument. Then what would happen is then we can assimilate and integrate, get clear, and then be clear about what we know with precision because we have the same shared vocabulary. There'll be some things that we could get very, very clear on, you know, rats and mazes without a behavioral versus cognitive neuroscience split. We just have actually the whole explanation. You know, and then there'll be a lot more. That's what my current book is trying to show, is that there is an opportunity for, and ultimately this gets back to what, you know, what I really care about is that I think that science has done a great many things positive, but it also has done a lot of damage to our souls. Okay. And I believe that that's a big, I believe that's a big problem. I believe the reductive mechanist matter in motion view of science, just like Ken Wilber, it's a flatland view. That's what the combination of that ideology and then all this fragmented particulate research findings with no coherent understanding so that the public can actually metabolize what it might mean it's an interactive disaster relative to what, here's the general way to understand what science is, what psychology is, how to use it to nourish your soul, you know, and then and move from there so that the public can actually metabolize and make sense out of it. That to me is what my current passion is that there is a much, much better way to organize the data so that you know how to relate to yourself, relate to your kids, be in a community with a lot more sanity rather than chaotic identity shift. That's the unified approach side of the Atua Garden, you know, it's this old message that we can find wisdom, energy through this intellectual organization much more clearly than saying, oh, you're just a bunch of chemicals. That's what we figured out. It's like, oh, no, that's not what we figured out. That's a philosophical error. So anyway.
The hard versus soft science, because Andre, yes, this question in your list here, is it a distinction based on complexity and softness or vocabulary and meta theories? It's both.
Both.
As you get more complex, it becomes more language game.
Right.
Definitely.
But I am trying to focus that there's actually a way to solve the vocabulary language game.
It doesn't have to be a language game. We don't have to. If there's any game to play, it's that one.
Well, right. I mean, well, my argument is you're always going to be playing a language game. I mean, the language game is the system of justification that you're going to employ. We have bought the idea that there would be no meta language game that would tie together. That's now the language game. It's the assumption. And people live with that and are fine with that, and they believe they've already discovered that that's inevitable. That is my point to say, actually, no, we just didn't have the right angle on it. There's a meta game that's totally available to us, and we can understand totally why we got confused, where the confusion is and have new angles that allow insight and clarity and light to be shown on this issue and get to the stage where we could actually develop a shared vocabulary. And that's cool. That would be great if we had a shared vocabulary. It doesn't solve all the problems. Doesn't mean we understand everything, but in the same way, but it's the difference between what we understood in biology in 1950 after, Watson and Crick, they get the DNA, we got that. We are now connected to molecular biology. We have the gene, we have the cell, we have natural selection. That's a hell of a lot of understanding in biology that's radically different than 100 years ago, okay? There is a way to organize our understanding about psychology that is very parallel. That's the argument. And by psychology, I mean first basic, one of the most important things, basic animal psychology, which is one thing, and then human psychology, which is a totally different field. It's a totally different set of fields because it raises all of this problem of my dog is just as the dog's experience. They don't become the narrative extension, and then we have to wonder about, well, what am I? Is my experience or this conversation or am I Nick? I mean, my dog Benji is just wandering around being, right? Because narrative doesn't create narrative opens this whole feedback loop that's insanely complicated on top of the system. And that's why human psychology is totally different than dog psychology and the rest of the animal kingdom.
I was thinking that it is not casual that such a theory, the TOK system, has been conceived by a psychologist, because I think, as you said before, Greg, that your main drive was the problem of psychotherapy. So a very feminine problem. And then you started to dialogue with your more masculine part, the scientific part. And I think that one of the main merits of the TOK system is that it can reconciliate knowledge with wisdom, okay? And I think that harder scientists are too much in their scientific mind to care about the more feminine part, so to transform knowledge into wisdom. And I think that is one of the main merit of the TOK, because we have to transform knowledge into wisdom, because, as you said before, science has done, no doubt, many good things, the progress, technological progress, and so on and so on. But we are living, as you often say, in a meta crisis that is both a meaning crisis, a mental health crisis, and a technological crisis, and an ecological crisis. And science actually seems not to be helping so much in getting things better. So we have definitely to aim to wisdom and to knowledge, but at the same time to wisdom. Nope. And I also think that there is a sort of parallel between the process of psychotherapy, where in which you integrate different part of yourselves. So you aim basically at an integration of your different parts, and so this is the first person subjective point of view, and then the basic archetypal process can be done in the scientific language game, in which you try to get the different parts dialoguing together to get a coherent whole.
Totally. Yeah, no, there's a lot of, I see all sorts of parallels. I mean, I in psychotherapy, I like internal family systems model. I don't operate from that as a primary domain, but the idea that we grow up with these different roles and we have these different motives and needs, okay? We see this in families, and of course, families, you have the different people playing their roles, right? And then in psychotherapy, you realize, oh my God, I've got a sexual energy part, and I have a little child part, and I have my old trauma part, and I have my rational trying to control, manage part, and then I get upset and I freak out, and I have my firefighter part, and just trying to put out, It's like, and these are each different modes. And this is a classic psychodynamic insight that you have these different modes of energy. They seek expression in particular times. They get energized, but they also conflict. And then what is health? Well, health's a lot of the coherent integration and navigation between these where they get expression, but don't necessarily become dominant because they have to then live in the dialectical relation. And I'm always saying, it's like, well, when you do it healthy, it's this healthy dialectic between masculine and feminine, or, you know, approach, avoid, you know, power and love, all of that, you know, in a complex, interconnected, but holistic realm versus the fragmented, I'm going to be all this, I'm going to be all that. This is all good. Rigidity, cognitive rigidity, borderline organization, all of that stuff's about fragmentation. And I believe that, yeah, you look over at the sciences and we gave up and this, by the way, is really interesting. In a couple of different times, really from the mid 19th century, you know, 1850s or so, you got people like Spencer, you have Hegel and Spencer and Comte, who's a little earlier, but still you have this idea that we're going to try to create an integrated, holistic picture of the sciences. Okay, I mean, that happens for 150 years up until like the 1950s. The logical positivists were actually the really last systemic attempt for unity of the sciences. And there was this concern that we should think about the sciences in effective holistic relation. And in the 1920s, actually Conrad Lloyd Morgan, a comparative psychologist, was the leader of what's called emergent evolution. Okay, and this was the idea. Basically, it's the big history idea. We can see, although we didn't have the Big Bang yet, so the Big Bang really helped make this clear, we can see a time by complexification angle on this. That's called emergent evolution over time. And we can stack the sciences in coherence in this regard, okay? And it flourishes, emergent evolution, especially in Britain, it flourishes for a while, and it looks like it's going to be able to, and then the logical positives come around and undercut it. And what also happens, and this is a very key point that we have to figure out, there's a proliferation of them. Okay, there are all these different models, right? And we see this on the list, you know, like this guy Eric, he's popping his model out, Deepak on the TOK list. You have people sort of like, hey, I've got a version of this. And there are millions of different possible versions of this thing. And because at one level, it's a map territory relation. So it's what angle do you want to emphasize? So then you can generate lots of different maps, okay? And the territory itself is very hard to see holistically in all of its features. And then they were tried the rigid science version of logical positivism. And they were the big dogs from like 1930 and 1940. And then that whole project basically falls apart, that you really can't line it up with like a physicist logic and empirical process, put the blocks together, that anything that makes sense, this is early Wittgenstein thought you could do this, anything that would make sense would be then plopped into truth claims, okay, hardcore reality, that's logic and evidence, and then all the constructed bullshit about my opinion and my subjectivity would be factored out. That's what logical positivism tries to do. And then it collapses. It collapses for a whole host of different reasons. And then we get the postmodern critique. We get it philosophically, the philosophy of language and continental philosophy merges. We get the postmodern critique socially, or the social justice movement, you know, and the entire system basically is like, yep, nope, any unity of knowledge and scientific knowledge is dead. You had all the proliferation of emergent evolutionists, so you can't sort out what's better. What's the evidence that your map's better than mine? Well, what map's kind of what you want. My intuition is these are the angles we should look at. My intuition says these are the angles. Well, how the hell do you decide? And then we go from like the 1950s to 1990s with basically a void, okay? And the void of, meaning the void of the big picture view. It gets broken down and nobody pays a lot of attention. Now, since the 1990s or the last 20 years, there are now these naturalistic, holistic views. Edward Wilson's Consilience is really a landmark book in that regard. He's trying to get us to pay back attention to the big picture view. And Dave Christian's Big History is also that effort. It's like, oh my God. And both of them see what we see in terms of the breakdown of our ability to make sense without any coherent big picture view of what science is, to then extract it to make sense in the world, especially a fast changing, massively ecologically, informationally polluted world,
Yeah.
how the hell people are actually going to use this to make sense? And in fact, they don't. That what it's a postmodern is a description of the state of affairs. I mean, everybody just got whatever fucking eminent reality they believe and their justification and whatever data they want to pull off the internet. And we are, we're experiencing, I think, a postmodern crisis. And so that's we have to be aware. The nice thing about the tree of knowledge, why do I always pair the tree of knowledge with the problem of psychology, is to say there's a part of the territory that stems off the Enlightenment gap that gives rise to the problem of psychology that can be solved. That's what I'm trying to do with that. Okay, so and the idea is like, oh my God, you can build a big picture system that can solve this huge philosophical scientific problem. Holy shit, that my hope would be that the system, the institution, be like, oh my God, that'd be so exciting. You could actually do that. You can clearly specify the problem, clearly show the math, and show how it makes vocabulary wise and meta theoretically ties together to give us this. Oh, this would be so great. And of course, what happened is people are like, nah, how do you know? I don't know. It's like, holy
It's so absurd. It's so absurd. It's just everybody's looking at different maps. We're all looking at the maps of the same thing. We're all looking at the same thing. What is the confusion about? Like,
yeah,
it's there. It's there.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anyway, those are all, it's a fascinating history and time. But I do think, like all these times, the zeitgeist swings. I think the postmodern confusion has reaching its peak. I think the felt chaos of the real world and its uncertainty is waking people up to say, wait a minute. And I think the idea of an integrated pluralism with the proper dialectic that allows for coherent integration around certain things that we can see and appreciates unique perspectivalism in proper dialectic, I think that sensibility is on the horizon. And as people appreciate that, the opportunity to swing back and be like, oh, okay, yes, let's hold our diversity and see the integrated unity in proper relation. And then boom, if we achieve that dialectic, then that to me is a lot, we'll cultivate wisdom out of that dialectic a lot more high probability.
So Greg, on one of I can't remember what post on the listserv a few weeks ago, I had made some weird rant comment where I remember feeling something about the dialectic that represents, or the triangle that represents the dialectic being like upside down. I think this was the mind body argument. I can't remember the guy's name, but so is this downward causation essentially what you're talking about here?
Okay, well, all right. So well, to me, downward causation is a slight topic shift. I love the potential shift into it, but that's a whole nother we got to then shift into ontology. Right. Okay. Yes. So if we're making a conscious shift that's one of our
theoretical topics. Sense.
Yep. I'm happy to enter into, but let's at least bracket this because we sort of got a good conversation of that is related and it's on our list. So I'm happy to make the transition. Let me check in. Andre, do you want to? How does that, if we go into downward causation, or is there anything to me that will feel like a slight topic, although we'll come back to a number of things that we covered, but.
Okay. Yeah.
Since we can talk some about downward causation, and then I'd like to double click back into empirical evidence issues. Okay. Because I think I alluded to that.
That's fine for me.
And I emphasize the metaphysical and then meta-theoretical angle, okay? But you're absolutely right. There are lots to be said about the more specific angle of the ideas themselves and what it would mean for an empirical investigation and I will say then the empirical investigation, I'd like to pose two different meanings of that. A qualitative first-person empirical investigation, okay? Because it should be able to hold on both accounts. We should be able to allow you to go out into the world, okay? And you should be able to see people as investors, okay? You should watch what they do and their energy and their effort and their time distribution towards particular goal states should be framed by behavioral investment. You should be able to sort of see that, okay? You should be able to see dynamics of influence, okay? About how they bounce into other people, what happens, and we should be able to see how that they're justifiers, okay? And that should, GI dynamics should be a way in which you can then describe, instead of your normal belief desire, you can see yourself and other people around investing, influencing, justifying. Okay. It should afford that angle. And then we should also be able to say, yeah, there's specific kinds of and potentially novel predictions that arise out of these systems that then we should go to the literature, see a gap, ask questions, and then gather data and determine whether or not it supports or invalidates the frame. So all of that is true as far as I'm concerned. All of that, the setup is there for all of that. And that's all, it would have to be there for the system to be the kind of proposal that I'm suggesting that it is. It has to fit with the, I'm not trying to undo science, I'm trying to strengthen it and allow it to be organized so it can confer wisdom in the real world with much better efficiency and effectiveness than it's currently doing. So, all right, so but now let's, yeah, the issue of causation is unbelievably key here, okay? You know, Nick brought up downward causation, and I know that was, you wondered about epistemological versus ontological causation in these ways, and I am happy to, why don't we just throw some questions out there and then we can kick this topic off.
So I think that one of the main questions that is related to what we were talking about is very simple, but at the same time, it can be complex. And it is BIT and justification hypothesis, or just, are they falsifiable or not? Can you falsify the BIT? Because to me, that is directly related to the main topic we were discussing earlier. So you were talking about the need of a meta-theoretical consilience. So the need of a logical way to solve the alignment gap. Okay. But at the same time, I don't know if that's a problem, that's a sort of limitation of current mainstream academic institution. And so in order to get attention, you have to prove something that is, okay? Or,
absolutely.
Okay, so the question is very simple. So you think the BIT can also, do you think that BIT can lead to new specific predictions about our mental behavior?
Okay, so those are two different questions. So at a general falsifiable level, absolutely. The whole, it's embedded in a whole network of scientific claims about reality. Like if the Big Bang gets falsified, or if evolutionary theory gets falsified, which I both think they can be falsified, okay? You know, that's a whole, I have a friend, John Torday, when I hung out with him for a year, he has this whole other way, really kind of a Lamarckian physiological frame. Now he thought it was consistent with BIT, but the way in which he framed the evolutionary process, okay, was, I mean, he was very critical of neo-Darwinian theory, and had a whole different kind of physiological unfolding, that if that were to be revealed, there were definitely some implications about how learning happens that makes BIT definitely incomplete, okay, if not wrong. Okay? So in other words, it says, hey, you're missing a huge chunk of the equation here. All right. So and then it's incomplete. Now, you know, the principles, it's hard to say if it's falsifiable. I mean, the principles of behavioral investment theory in particular are extracted principles like evolution that are built on, you know, here's an idea, the effects that you have in your action feed back on whether or not you engage in that action in future behaviors. Is that claim falsifiable? Well, in some ways, I guess all of a sudden it could be falsifiable, but that the evidence for behavioral selection, at least at a process level and experimentally, is so powerful that it would be like, it'd be hard to know how to falsify that, because it's basically the law of effect is one of the most foundationally, I'll pause here, one of the most foundationally understood and evidence-based assertions about how the world works. So the level of meta theory, when you're doing meta theory, you are backing up and you're saying, oh, here are all these theories based on all these facts, okay, that then then I'm going to extract, and then so I'm already grounded in a huge amount of fact. That's basically the point. And so it's at a principle level. Could you I'll make a prediction. Another way of saying it, I'll put it in theory, therapy terms. I'll make a prediction that the quality of the relationship that you have with your patient has a lot to do with the outcome. Could you falsify that? Well, in theory, but the data is already there. I mean, it's like we don't even know that. Okay.
Okay. So I have another question that is related to this one, and so I think that. As you know, I'm in love with the justification hypothesis and with just in general. But I don't know if I still don't understand the BIT properly. If I think it's weaker than the justification hypothesis or just, because what I is the following: is that if we get from physics to biology, okay, when we get into biology, we have some emergent properties which define life, so growth, reproduction, and so on and so on. But then when we get to the mind plane of existence, all the 6 principles of the BIT are already present in the physics domain and in the life domain. So we have evolution, we have energy dynamics, we have learning, we have development, and so on. But all these 6 principles are already present, especially in the biological plane of existence. So do you think that in order to get a new theory about what is mind, what is the mental plane of existence, we should have some emergent properties? I don't know. For example, I think that one emergent properties, or at least one thing we do have in the mind plane and we do not have in the biology plane, is the fact that we, at least to our knowledge, we cannot have a mind without a brain. So I think,
okay.
No, okay.
Yep. So so a couple of things here. Yes, you're right that the first principle is energy economics. So that goes down into physics, work effort. So biology is answer to that. That goes that way. Okay.
Obviously, yeah.
Then you're in an evolutionary thing. Yes, that's consistent with life. And then you have the behavioral genetics, which is basically the genetic principle. So the main thing that emphasizes is, yes, it's the domain of life that mind is coming out of. Okay. Now, that may sound obvious, but I want to be very clear that that's not all. Philosophy is not anchored that. Philosophy, Rene Descartes, in virtually all philosophy, is matter mind. I always emphasize this in relationship to it's matter relative to mind. And and modern systems is always somebody like John Vervaeke, and this book I mentioned, The Mental Order, and this book, 2020 book on the evolution of the sensitive soul.
Yeah.
Okay. They say the same thing. They're like, wait a minute, we want to make sure that when we're talking about natural mind, there's artificial intelligence, but natural mind in the natural world is coming out of life, and that's a big deal. Okay? So that's sometimes overlooked. So that makes a point. All right. The second point is point 4 is the neurocomputational control principle. Okay. Okay. So now actually that then jumps you. And the whole point is that the neurocomputational control of what? Of a complex active body. Neurocomputational control of a complex active body. And that is the kingdom of an animal that is radically different than the other 5 kingdoms. Okay. And it's you get jellyfish. That's not what I mean by mind. But then there is what's called the Cambrian explosion, 540 million years
Yeah.
ago. Okay. And from that 200, the long version of the Cambrian explosion, the short version is about 20 million years. The long version is about 100 million years, depending on how you slice it. But essentially, there's an explosion of change. Okay. And what has happened is that all of a sudden you had sensory systems and motor systems that are disintegrated, but they get integrated. You get a bilateral plan like in a planaria worm, and then you get a segmented body, and then which then becomes an active mechanical movement system, which is totally different. Virtually all life is chemical until you get animals. There's some plants that do some mechanical shit, but it's qualitatively different. Mechanical movement mediated and regulated by biology is totally different. So sensory motion is what Aristotle identifies as animals, and they're totally qualitatively emergent, properly different than plants. Okay.
Yeah.
For the most part. And so there's definitely an emergent behavioral difference. Okay. Buzzing bees around flowers are doing all sorts of weird shit, but the buzzing bee colony that's pollinating those fucking flowers are doing a whole nother layer of weird shit. Okay. Animal behavior is a radically different emergent property. And then animals interacting with each other creates a whole nother layer of behavioral complexity.
Yeah.
Okay. And then at the quality level, my argument would be that there's no real animal cells have some degree of subjective semantic processing. Okay. So they have an internal network of information processing rule structures. They make decisions in some ways.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to believe, in my estimation, that when we talk about conscious experience, we should not think about cells as conscious.
Yeah, of course.
In a psychological sense, okay? They exhibit functional awareness and response. They move towards the light. They go away from the toxin. They do all that. That's functional awareness and response. And they have a semantic system of information processing.
Yes.
But there's nothing to say that it's something like to be a bacteria cell. I don't know what that means at all.
To feel as if it has its own experience.
Exactly. To be what it is. Yes. To something that it is like to be. Now, what this book says, and it's totally consistent with behavioral investment theory. Okay. And I'm reading deeply on the evolution of consciousness, mind 2. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So first in mind 1, you have a computational control system and clams and shit like that. Then you get a centralized brain and a complex active body. Okay. Now, what happens, in my estimation, and what this is, essentially is this. Just when you start moving around this complex active body, you have to do what John Vervaeke calls participatory knowledge, okay? Which is basically agent, arena, environment in a dynamic interfacing relation. And that's particularly true if you're doing predator-prey shit, like some predator's trying to eat your ass. You got to figure out where the hell is it.
Like survival, the survival instinct.
Well, right, but it's movement survival. So cells try to survive, but now this is mechanical movement against mechanical movement survival. Like, get the fuck out of there and go fuck that thing. I mean, it's basically, okay. So now, how do you do that? What you see in the development of the brain is it's the intersection of really 3 fundamentals. One is the exterior sensory system. Okay, so you integrate all that and you drop it into a centralized control to get a map of the model of the environment and your relationship to it. Okay, that's one. Then you have all the stuff that plugs into your bodily regulatory functions. That's your interoception, which is what's the state of your body, what is the homeostatic state, and what do you need in relationship to your homeostatic state. Okay. Then what you get is a motor output function that basically energizes action away from shit. Don't get eaten there and go eat that thing. Okay. And what I believe happens here, and this is basically the sensitive soul, is there's a broadcast function that begins to emerge to organize these 3 parts: exterior, interior, and affective valence, okay? Which basically is pleasure and pain, all right? So you get a pleasure and pain, which is now creates a unified broadcast function that's nature's way, and this goes way back, people have said this for a long time, but nature's way of saying do more of that and do less of that. Okay.
Yeah. And
that's the first, those are what I call the base of sentience. And this is the first, when we say, what is it like to be like a bee, probably a bee, in my estimation, probably, we don't really, because we know so little about subjectivity. We know what it's like in mammals and birds. We don't know what it's like in fish and insects in particular, if they have it at all. We just don't know. but it might have flashes of pleasure and pain, definitely. But we can definitely say then what happens is with fish, I think the argument is very good in vertebrates, okay, that they at least, but they don't suffer, interestingly enough. So they like have sharp pain, but they don't have the same chronic capacity to suffer like on animals and
Suffering is a
mammals.
narrative.
Yeah.
Actually, suffering is a memory, okay, of an extended self over time. So here's an interesting hypothesis: is that when you crawled out on the land, the necessity for cognitive maps, and especially like to find water and other food holes, is more complicated when you climb up on land. Okay, so then the capacity to project self over time, to anticipate things like thirst, and then track the self when requires what I call the deliberative move. So what you get, the deliberation is the rat in the T maze going, do I go left or right?
Yeah.
Fish are significantly less. Now what you get is what I think you get, the experiential self, which is basically the observed mind's eye, which starts to project onto a screen and then starts to see the perceptual mental imagery it's like, if I walk down this path, and you can see rats in a cage do this, they have monitors, and it's just like when they actually do it. They'll sit at the cage and they'll go, whether he's thinking going left or right at the cage, at the T point. It's super cool. You can just track, and they do action simulation down a road. I was like, oh, the water's this way, the pain is that way, I'm going this way. Okay.
I wasn't questioning the emergence of the mind plane of existence as something qualitatively different from the life.
Okay.
I don't know. I think that that, for example, the emergence of justifications can characterize the cultural plane of existence, but and that it's fine to me. But I think that the BAT with its 6 principles, don't you think that it would be better, for example, as to characterize the mind plane of existence with consciousness, for example, with a basic form of consciousness that fluctuates between pleasure and pain.
Yep.
And so because consciousness, as you said earlier, is not per se a process that is present in biology.
Yep.
So maybe I'd see it more clearly if we depict the emergence of the mental behavior as the emergence of a basic form of consciousness, like Damasio's core consciousness. So this perpetual
the reason, so that's a great question, and certainly if this version of reality holds, okay,
yeah,
and what my hope is, and what would be brilliant, a lot, especially right along these lines, which would line everything up, lines up the emergent property, lines up the proper definition of mind and everything else, and gets clear, is this idea that the Cambrian explosion integrates complex active bodies, neurocomputational control, and the emergence of pleasure and pain as a new quality of existence. And if all of that shit comes online at the same time, basically, then you have a clear joint point, okay? And that lines up, and it's brilliant, okay? The issue that I had, and we still don't know, is that it's still very possible, and many people make the argument, that you don't really get consciousness. It depends on what you define as consciousness, and we still don't know. It's still plausible for the skeptics to rule out consciousness below mammals and birds. Like, we've really only documented that the kind of phenomenological consciousness that we identify in our own like, can you see it or not subliminally? Then what's the ignition wave? It's called the cortical thalamic loop. They just proved in crows, using the same basic process, that crows now, I would say with almost certainty, crows have subjective experience and use that to determine what kind of behavioral mechanisms they're going to do. And you can measure that. In other words, there's a wave, and then whether the wave happens, they've had that experience. If they've had that experience, they'll make behavioral choices. If they haven't, they won't. So you line all that up and you're like, yep, crows are fucking conscious, okay? In the phenomenological sense. All the arguments that something like a praying mantis or even a fish experiences pain are all analogous, probabilistic, and possible, because we do not understand the ontology of how brain produces subjectivity still. I mean, we're way far away from that. So here would be the problem. Let's say we find out that actually it is when they climbed out and when they started developing cortical thalamic loops, that's really everything. The praying mantises and even my, goldfish are basically robots. There's no consciousness there. Well, they at a behavioral level, at a functional awareness and response mind one level, the emergent properties are there. Plants, bees are always behaving differently than plants, whether they're have any subjective experience of being or not. So the argument that I was going to make that we could then see from science perspective is that what's emergent is the sensory motor behavioral functional awareness and response action of an animal. That's clear. That's demonstrable and scientifically demonstrable. If that coordinated participatory action then is actually also being coordinated by pleasure and pain, and we can actually nail when the subjective experience of being comes online and show that aligns with participatory interaction, well then we really would have a nice joint point that then lines up our definitional system. That's what my hope is. And actually I think the data, I think that a logical argument for that is certainly available to us, but not enough to be like, it's probable, but not strongly defensible at this juncture.
Wow, great. And
I think the other thing I want to say is that BIT itself is not too novel. I want to be clear.
It's not.
It's not novel. It's not very new. Okay, it's like many. If you know how to look for that, the argument that is in BIT has been made in various forms by a lot of people over time. I mean, Aristotle, for the love of God. Okay. And this argument right here, this idea of the Cambrian explosion, that sensory motor movement is defined so what the brain is and all this other stuff. I can find 10 different articles or books that essentially make this case. Okay. Now, what's new about it is really its place in the tree of knowledge system. Okay. As a joint point, and the understanding that the relation of the joint point between life and mind, okay, allows us a cleave. I structured it mostly to bridge the metaphysics of behaviorism, especially Skinnerian behaviorism, with neurocognitive functionalism, and argued in the TOK, that 2003 book, that remember we talked about the evolution of biology. It's Darwin's theory of natural selection with genetics that give rise to the cell. That genetics is an information processing storage component thing. Natural selection operates on it. B.F. Skinner identifies, he calls himself the Darwin of operant theory at some various points. He identifies behavioral selection, but his exterior epistemology fails to make the obvious jump then that the nervous system is an information processing computational control system. But that's his philosophy that prevents you from making that. Everyone else agrees that's actually a good argument. So what's really unique about BIT is not so much the 6 principles, because those are all really just drawn from everybody else, and they're kind of common sense brain behavior stuff. But what's really new is the idea that there is an important joint point that, like, everybody, like, they overlook that big history doesn't even identify this as a threshold. They have 9 fucking thresholds, and it's not even one of them. You know, it's a sub threshold that goes big life. Well, big life is different. That's plants, and then animals is not even. They don't have any of that. And then all of a sudden, they have 4 different thresholds for humans, because we all of a sudden start talking. I'm sorry, guys. Animals did a lot of shit to get from There's a lot going on there. So it's a metaphysical, meta-theoretical organization that allows you to ground the base of psychology. Okay, you go back to comparative psychology and realize that, like, George Romanes, I've been studying his mental evolution. Everybody dismisses George Romanes because he projected so much mentality into animals. Actually, he had a great model. And his whole book is on mental evolution, exactly what mind is. This 3rd dimension. Completely. If you open it up, you read, it's exactly what he was concerned about. But we lose it. So it's the metaphysical, it just absorbs all the other insights from everybody else, organizes them, and then jams them into a metaphysical picture. That gives you clarity. And then, of course, you're right. Let's talk about my history. I mean, when you go to Just, I knew, and it's an unbelievable insight. Just itself is the novel, Just into TOK is what is my special relativity into general relativity. I mean, it's the holy shit. Okay. The problem of propositional knowledge and the question answer dialogue the structure of that adaptive problem. I can tell you exactly how propositional, well, there's just a couple of steps to get to. Now propositional is here. Oh my God, propositional knowledge creates question-answer dialogue. Question-answer dialogue creates the problem of justification. There's the analytic and value problems of that are inside and out. And that now I just take Freud and Beck and all this and even feminism. And it's like, holy shit, I understand how we went from primates to persons, and I can assimilate and integrate in a fundamentally new way. Why were the rational animal, just switch it to justify an animal. And now I have that line, and no one had that line. That is, you know, people, and I've been surprised at how hard that is for people to see. And maybe because I then layered it into the tree of knowledge and problem of psychology. It's like, you know, and then I got it plagiarized, you know, I mean, you know, I don't want to get into that, but, you know, I definitely got it stolen.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's fundamental. I mean, the idea that, you know, everyone just talks about language, you know, I'm psychodynamic. The idea that actually you have to give accounts and justify why did you do and empower relations and love relations, all of a sudden that's a big goddamn problem. And what did Freud say? You got super ego social stuff, you got an ego regulator, and you got impulses, and that's a problem. So what do? Rationalize based on the compromise formation. It's like, yep, that's exactly what you would do. So that was definitely a key that unlocked then a cascade of new insights.
Yeah, I agree with you that in the main intuition, the most important intuition is that the mind, the fucking psychology, as its place in the hierarchy of sciences, and then the mental level of existence is emergent and autonomous from the biological one. Because, as you say, because of the problem of psychology and the alignment gap, Wilson, for example, did not acknowledge the problem, and the mainstream approaches do not acknowledge it. So I'm with you that regardless of the specific principle of the BIT, the most important thing is to give mind its importance. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Yep. Nope. That's and I'm really excited. I'm going to Zoom with Mike Mascolo because as I sent him his little diagram that he wrote in the whole tinnitus. You guys say, how do you say it, Nick? You say tinnitus. Do you say tinnitus or tinnitus? People say it differently. Tinnitus. Okay. But anyway, that diagram, you know, I see that as like, Mike, that's mind 1, 2, 3, A and B. We just do the filters and stuff like that. That's a big deal because Mike's got a different epistemology, but if we line up on that stuff. So I look forward to that. And yeah, I mean, you can, if you have the right lens, you read E.O. Wilson. I mean, I was looking through, you know, Steve Pinker's thing a little while ago. And, you know, I loved How the Mind Works when it came out, you know, and it's a good book, definitely. But I always remembered, and I found the little quote. It's like, oh, by the way, I don't deal at all with the experience. I don't deal at all with mind too. I don't know about anything about that. That's interesting. I'm now going to write my 700-page book on how the mind works, just with mind 1, neurocognitive functionally. I'm in no goddamn question at all about the difference between the worms at mind 1 and then the experience of a crow at mind 2, not to mention justification, which he gives, you know, like 2 sentences to. And it's like, oh my God, that's how the mind works. You know, that's the scientific, because it falls under the mechanistic analysis of computation, like where it's just machine. The language systems of the Enlightenment allow for that to be at Harvard, you know, and that's what, but consciousness is all, well, why is it so confusing, consciousness? Because you don't have the right philosophy, you idiots, because you don't have the right big picture view to know how to put it in, what the language game of science is playing relative to reality writ large in proper relation. Now you're missing that point. You boxed yourself in and gave and said, that's your authority. And now we're going to pray to the gods of the institutional authority and be like, but when you go home and argue with your wife, where's that coming from? I thought you're just neuro-computational computation. No, you're pissed because your feelings were hurt. You sounds like, you know, that's
like this stuff doesn't have to be rocket science.
I mean, you know, you at least need to be able to acknowledge that, you know, I mean, and realize that that's a pretty big caveat. Like, no, we're just going to do computational neuroscience. Like, well, you know, we at least got to be asking that question. And we have, I mean, like the consciousness people, like global oral workspace, that's a damn good set of ideas, and it lines up and it allows us to have, mind one into mind two frames of reference. But man, you better deal with it.
So just to briefly shift us onto like ontology,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of wordplay, I think, on our listserv with ontology, ontic, and epistemology. And I know, Andre, you brought this up.
Yeah, right.
So from the TOK perspective, the different joint points are, in terms of the ontic, is the same. They share the same essence, which would be what, that energy at the Big Bang, or the Big Bang, I guess, would maybe be the ontic, or is that even the ontological, which I
Okay,
see
this is good. Yeah, okay. So there's couple of different issues here. I'm glad you're raising this. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I've had these confounded up until 2 years ago. Okay, I didn't have a distinction between ontology and the ontic reality.
Yeah,
I never made really that distinction. For me, ontology was always just the philosophy of the real. And
Yeah.
that's a fairly standard meaning. But I didn't realize, just I had the same problems with metaphysics. I didn't realize that actually there are lots of different ways to slice this, okay, when you really look at it, okay? So there's a Heideggerian kind of view of ontology. Heideggerian is what I would call foundational ontology. There's just, how do we use philosophy to get to being itself, whatever, and then whatever that would be, okay? That's Heidegger and many other kinds of domains. There's also what I would call like common scientific ontology. And by that I mean, that's the science then is about the theory about what's real, okay? And now you want to differentiate, well, the ontological claim is the scientist making the claim, that's the map of the ontic reality that is the territory.
Right.
Okay? And now I want to be like, yeah, and in fact, the whole basic common sense scientific realism is the idea that science maps and models of the ontic reality, okay? And then now you have ontology and ontic reality, okay? And now you have that distinction. Now that distinction is not really, other people will make that, you Wikipedia what ontic reality is and you find that, but it's not clear. The philosopher of science, Roy Bhaskar, who I've also become a big fan of, okay? He's a meta-modern philosophy of science guy. He died in 2014, but his system. He's like Ken Wilber, and Ken Wilber and he were having critical realism and integral theory. There's a nice book on two big meta theories of the 21st century. Anyway, so what he identified, which is the exact same thing, is the transitive ontology, which refers to our scientific beliefs, about the intransitive, which refers to that which exists outside of our beliefs, okay? His intransitive ontology is my ontic reality. That's the shit that exists independent of your beliefs versus how your beliefs change, okay? Now, the problem is why this is so damn complicated is because right now I will tell you, okay, that, yeah, the ontic reality begins with the Big Bang, okay? But be wary, that's what I'm saying. That's an ontological claim.
An ontological claim, yeah.
Okay, that I am now then saying about the ontic reality. Okay,
Right.
and that's why people, and they criticize Roy Bhaskar about, well, your claims, but now I'll just say, no, I just will say the Big Bang is in my head, that's a map, and I'm saying that if we took a picture and there's good evidence that says that this would make some level of sense, that if at one point the universe didn't exist, or then it goes back and exists as this pure energy, okay, which is a meaningful correspondence at some map level. It's not reality, but it's a meaningful correspondence, and that did exist in the Lee, and Lee will tell you, he'll tell you it existed. The real,
I say what we are.
you know,
It's literally
so-
what we are.
So yeah, so the other thing I want to always, there's the reality, which is the territory, and the map. You know, that can be overshot, and they're all complicated. But so there's an ontology. Now, the other thing that Roy Bhaskar did, which I really liked, okay, is the way he juxtaposed these using three concepts. He used the real, the actual, and the empirical. Okay, and actually I found this to be helpful in my conversation with Jordan Hall. So what is the real? The real is the bridging concept between our ontology of theory, which then says, hey, these are the potential real generating mechanisms, okay, like gravity Like gravity is a good example of what would be a real. So, so we have an idea that there's a force out here that creates a generative potential. Okay. Now, that generative potential could give rise to lots of different actualities. Okay. But then there's one, at least, you do multiverse shit, but for now we'll say there's one actual reality that started to unfold. And so actuality refers to out of the potential, what was out of that happen, that a historian could then potentially go and then find the actual events. Now, the process by which you then could find an actual event
that parallels with Aristotle's virtual and real.
Yep.
I think.
Right, exactly. And in fact, in quantum theory, then you would have this, you have the real potential, which then is giving constant fluctuations to virtual, at least in the virtual particle elements. Okay, and then actually those virtual particle elements reach thresholds that become actual realities.
Right.
And then go ahead. Okay.
I was going to make a point about how there are virtual particles in vacuums and in space. That it's clicking for me. So.
Exactly. So that's the space between the real potential, that then there's actually space in between that becomes the actual. Okay. And then there's a whole nother space between the actual and the empirical, where the empirical reveals that you need an observer, okay, that then has contact with whatever domain of the actual. So we all exist on our observer horizon. Okay, we obviously, I can't observe galaxies that I have no contact with, but they actually exist. Okay, but then when I see them, now they become into the set of the empirical. And that we don't need to get too deep into it, but that actually had lots of implications for me to line up what I was getting at with the whole fucking I-quad formula and everything, because the I-quad formula fundamentally is about what's the real into the actual, into what's empirically observed across measurement, across phenomenological observation and justification of the data from a third person perspective. I don't think the physicists have any real clue at the metaphysics of knowing. That's like, what's the measurement jump? What's the empirical observation jump? What's the justification jump into knowledge? Okay, those are actually all the process by which we actually metabolize empirical. Okay, is really interesting. And then because then that, and what Roy Bhaskar thinks is, yeah, you actually have to angle the knower in relationship to the potentially real generative mechanisms that create virtual realities, which collapse into actual potentials, and then you intersect them with empirical observation.
Wow.
And that's a holistic picture.
Wow.
And epistemology, what is its relationship with ontology? Because I think you referred to them confounding epistemology with ontology as the epistemic fallacy, I think, and so I don't know. For example, when I know I have my glasses on, okay, how do I separate my style of my way of accessing the environmental information from my schemas of the environmental information? So how can we differentiate between epistemology and ontology?
Totally. Right. Great question. So the epistemic fallacy is the term Roy Bhaskar uses to criticize Immanuel Kant. Okay. So if you understand the history of this, Roy Bhaskar argues that in philosophy with Kant, what Kant does with his unbelievably powerful analysis of epistemology, okay, and he anchors then epistemology to phenomenology. Remember, they differentiate the thing in itself from our phenomenological access to the thing. And that really is epistemological question. Hey, how do we know about anything? Well, the categories of the human mind imputed upon it, and then they create the phenomena, really. We can never get outside of it, and therefore that's the phenomena. And really what we're doing is basically everything is dependent upon human mind epistemology.
Yeah.
Okay? That's and philosophy and philosophy of science does that in a particular way. That's been a lot of people have had. Hegel actually steps outside of that, and Hegel does a correction, at least from a Hegelian German idealist perspective. But empiricism doesn't. I mean, the European into English into American empiricism is basically a Kant and Newton mix. Okay, we don't go with Hegel. And it's super interesting, the philosophy of phenomenology, basically from Hegel, that's what I learned, okay? And you have the Newtonian matter in motion, which really is sort of an ontological claim. There's matter and it's moving, okay? But we then know it through the empirical methods, and how we think about it is human phenomenological. That's essentially what we sort of get, okay? So that's essentially the setup. Now, what Roy Bhaskar does, okay, is he argues that you cannot collapse epistemology to ontology. And at some level, you can make a very clear, first off, you have a map of how the world works. He talks about like the principle of stratification, okay? The principle of stratification is an ontological principle. You might have achieved it epistemologically, but it's a claim about nature. Nature is organized from particles into atoms, into cells, and then or molecules, and then cells, etc. You get it, right? That's an ontological claim.
Yeah.
Okay. And it needs to be understood as an ontological claim. It doesn't reduce to epistemology. Okay. That is the process by which we know that is different than the thing.
Yes.
Okay. Now you can make claims that, well, the reason we know it is because we're human centered and the way the human creates categories, but that's a different thing than to say that nature is stratified. That's an ontological claim. Okay, so we are making, philosophically, we're making ontological claims. We are justifying them with epistemology, and that's the issue. We gather knowledge epistemologically, we justify epistemology, but the actual claims are ontological claims, and we need to pay attention to them. And he wants to recover realism here. He's a critical realist, which basically says nature really is stratified.
Yeah.
Not just that we believe it, it really is it. We have discovered that he calls it transcendental realism, which is there really are particles. You can't, I mean, and another nice thing about the particle into atom argument is what is the phenomenology of a part of quantum mechanics? In fact, there's no real phenomenology there at all. It's all equations and data that is so far removed from our cities that we can't even fucking make sense out of it. It's like the non-locality. We have this entire, I mean, it's the scientific experimental method that has yielded a picture of the universe that is completely alien to our phenomenology.
It's like object permanence.
Yeah, it's like,
out of mind.
yeah, it's like weird, okay? And so I think he makes a very good case that we should separate. You cannot reduce all ontological claims. Yes, you can. The neo-Kantian argument is certainly, and here's how I make this argument, is I'll sometimes say it's a unified theory of human knowledge. Okay, that's the neo-Kantian argument that says the reason we do see particles into atoms is because of our position, the nature of way we think about size, that did come through our perception. And, you know, the great question that I have is when and if, hopefully when, but if there are aliens, okay, and they're out there. My brother, by the way, just caught the alien bug. So I'm getting all this shit about the aliens are real. And oh my God, have you seen Tic Tac and all this other, so he's totally on the alien. He woke up to like, aliens are real. So I've been in the middle. Yeah, I've always been like, man, a lot of weird shit out there, may well be, you know, and so he's there. But anyway, my whole point at a epistemological level was, would an alien, let's say that thing that did Tic Tac. So in 2004, they watched these really weird behaviors. And let's just say that there's an alien sitting out there that's monitoring us and happens to cut through our, and then eventually it decides to open us up and say, hey, we want to talk to you, okay? My question is, well, given all their advanced technology, do they have the atomic theory of matter, just to use the example, okay? So the atomic theory of matter, if you ask Dis Feynman, he's a famous physicist, you're like, what do we know best? What would you tell other people? What are we most certain of? It's the material dimension is made up of these atoms that consist of protons and electrons, okay? That's the best ontological claim. If that's not true, then, I mean, everything else is networked to that. You take that off. So one really interesting question would be, if these creatures did all this other stuff and you ask them, what would it be like for them to say, no, we don't know anything about that? Okay, but here's our ontic reality in our ontology. Okay, and it's like we look at that and we don't know anything about those. There's a whole nother layer of energy information, or what I wouldn't even know how to speak of it, right, to potentially make sense and interact with the world to build technologies. So they have a theory of reality that's radically different and doesn't correspond to ours at all. Then that would make the Kantian case really that all of our knowledge really is, it's an ontology, definitely, but it's a human epistemologically grounded ontology that is fundamentally dependent upon the categories of mind in our position, right? Because then somebody else has another ontology that builds technologies that's not even related. So then we'd be like, oh my God.
The agreed upon reality.
Exactly. If, however, they were like, of course, and we have terms for helium and hydrogen, and this is how we understand the strong, weak nuclear forces. If that thing comes from a totally different domain, then you can actually say, yes, we have, and this is the argument from, that there's a transcendent realism. We've used scientific methods to really factor out our human categories. We really did do blind experiments, and we built an ontology of the ontic reality that actually holds up to correspondence across multiple observers of intelligent forms. And that's because that's the actual shape of the universe in its ontic form. And, you know, so that's the.
Would that mean, would that actually like mean that there's a difference between the observer and the observed? That they're fundamentally not the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a common sense level, there's a difference. If you're going to do any type of realism, a realism will always divide. Theory of knowledge realism is you have beliefs about reality. That's the standard realism theory of knowledge. And the constructivist / idealist view, if you're a constructive idealist, you're like, actually, you can escape epistemology, okay, at various levels, okay, meaning that yes. And so the test case would be an alien comes along, and if they have a completely different theory of reality than we do, then the epistemological reductivist, you know, the observer, the neo-Kantian view of phenomena wins. And then if they have the same basic periodic table of the elements, then the ontic realist view wins.
Yeah, yeah. Great.
Just gives me so many other questions. I don't even know how to formulate them.
Well, we got about 10 minutes. Is there another, you know, we don't want to press, the 3 people that actually watch this thing, we don't want to press them too much.
And I have a question and an issue that is not related to ontology and epistemology, but I think that is very important to talk about it. And is it about the communication of the TOK sensibility and the TOK ideas, and so how can we convey them in the better way and to make something change actually in the world? And so if you think that there is, as you know, I would like in my academic life to do actual research about the justification hypothesis and the unjust and so on. But more generally, do you think that the best channels to convey the TOK ideas are still within the academia, or that the world is changing, so we have to communicate them in through different mediums? I don't know, because I am very I mean, I love the theory. I love the listserv. I've been changed since I know it, because I have this very useful broad schema about reality that it is very useful when I have to decide about what to read, for example. Okay, so if I understand that there is a book about a very esteemed and famous psychologist, but if I understand that she thinks that we are nothing less than a bunch of chemicals, or if she focuses only on mind one, I won't read it. So since it is so useful for me, and since it clarified to me that I am interested in, especially in the joint point between mind and culture, because I think also the best research in the world nowadays is made in this around this joint point. I mean, cultural evolution and such. So
okay. Well, a couple of things. A couple of things here. So the first thing I'll say is I'm reading Michael Tomasello's book. So for you, okay, I think it's Becoming Human or whatever, a theory of ontogeny. It's most recent book. I strongly recommend you get that, especially if you're going to do, and I think his stuff and just, if we intersect some of those things at foundational levels, that'd be really interesting to do. Okay, so the short story of what he's writing on is the 500,000 year ago jump, okay, to 100,000 year ago, or whenever. It's hard to know when it happened, but basically our primate intersubjective, pre-linguistic intersubjective shared attentional capacities went qualitatively above the other great apes, okay, like 1 million years ago, 500,000 years ago. In other words, when 2-year-old infants point, okay, they track the intentionality, they want to create a shared intentional space for play. Other chimps don't do that at all. I mean, other great apes really don't have shared intentional intersubjective space where there is a real capacity to see, you care about shit, I can think about what you know, I make inferences about what you know really fast, and I want to get synced up with you so that we create a we space together. Okay, and they do it all, this is all pre-linguistic. Okay, so this is all, the influence matrix jumps into a relational field, systemic relation in our primate line that is, you know, it's just a, chimps do it well, we do it qualitatively better pre-linguistically. Okay, and then it's because we do that sets the intersubjective field to create the psychological language-based lexicon that we know what ringing is. And so I say, hey, I got a ringing in my ears like a concert. Yeah, it's like a loud concert. Oh, okay, now we can boom. Okay, so anyways, when studying how humans talk, and then what that backdrop of shared attentional space and the implicit intersubjectivity, that's going to then create the framing, and then Just will come in and tell you very clearly, once we then open up the propositional landscape, now there's a whole nother adjacent possibility we're going to navigate. It's going to constrain, it's going to open in a complex dynamic way, and boom, you can then make all sorts of cool predictions. And basically the matrix and Just will work together. Tomasello's stuff can get a parallel research, create the base of the sort of cognitive. And by the way, he talks a lot about relational recursion, and he doesn't use the term, but we do relational recursion with John Vervaeke's relevance realization. Boom, man, you do. I'm telling you, that cognitive structure on top of this relevance realization sets the arena. Now all of a sudden we have symbolics and tactical, and the whole, there's a gold mine of you know, integrative meta theory integration that then would get precise in terms of that. So that'd be super exciting when we talk about that. Okay, so that's one. That's more the, hey, let's go back to the academy and play the game of the academy, you know, and be like, woohoo, I want to be Steve Pinker. I was like, great, you know. I hope you are, my friend. I hope you are. Okay. So, and then there's two other issues that then we can wrap up, you know, on this. But then there's the whole issue about, well, where's the change going to be? Okay, and obviously, you know, I'm beating my drum. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool academic. I think that's where the leading edge of change is. And then the world, my world changes. So it's like, actually, no, the academic system right now is way too conservative relative to the magnitude of changes that are happening. And actually, and now I can say they're invested in modernity, okay, on the one hand, and now they're actually now getting invested in post-modernity in institutional kinds of ways that are now not up to the task of what the real 21st century sensibility is. Like they're like boom and boom, and it's like, and we're meta modern says, yep, all of that's true. Actually, traditional formal is really interesting. We got to go back and recapture some of those philosophies. And damn, the oral indigenous people, relations and connection and nature, holy shit. And so, and it's all
all of that. And the meta-modern sensibility has got to capture all of that. Now, if we get it right, and me and you and Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke, and we sync up and we actually can create a beacon, I mean, the Academy's smart, they'll eventually pick it up, but they are invested in institutions.
Yeah.
And who knows, I hope that the Academy can make the transition. I see, like, COVID, everybody's waking up and going, I don't know that this, maybe this is a Titanic, so you get, the zeitgeist has changed. I've got more interest in my work and more openness to it than ever. So I'm now bumped out, of course. I spend most of my time. I'm going to be the president-elect of this psychotherapy integration thing. So,
Congratulations.
it's both and, I guess. I'm doing theory. I'm not gonna be going back into the empirical world. I mean, I'll certainly consult with you and do all that, and I'd love to work with you, but I'm not gonna drop, I've got my message, and really, what I then evolved into is my philosophy of life. It's like, I can connect with other sages, and I created a weird intellectual path, and, it's a version of reality that I think is up to the task of doing better. And I'm sure other people have a really cool version of reality too. And then this gets to the last point that you were raising is as good a theorist I am, I'm an unbelievably shitty marketer. Okay. I just completely it's like, I don't give a shit about marketing. I don't care about my audience. I want to know what the hell I think, and I want to sort it all out. That's where all I care about. And I'll be honest, I hate psychology's relationship with marketing. I hate marketing in general. Okay. All you marketers out there, I love you, whatever, but it's just like, oh my fucking God. I hate that manipulative crap. And I'm
like you.
Really, I'm an agreeable, caring person. I mean, when I was working at Jiffy Lube, I tried to sell somebody like a wiper blade. I'd go up and be like, it's kind of expensive. I wouldn't buy it. Your wiper blades are a little streaky, but I'd go another time. I mean, I had the worst sales record in history. I then went into the bay so I could just work by myself and change oil, and I didn't want to pressure anybody into anything. So that's a huge problem, because the system I built is it's opposite of a fucking market. You got to layer it. You got to wonder. It's a cathedral. I actually like that it's kind of complicated. There's a part of me that's sort of like, yeah, you think it's badass. Well, you got to work your way into the goddamn labyrinth. Okay. I didn't have a problem with that. The problem that I have with it now is I'm like, oh shit, I'm actually trying to, I don't care too much. I want ego gratification. I worked through that in the 30s. I don't really, I have 3 fucking kids, and I'm actually concerned about the earth. I really am. I mean, it's like, I really feel like the earth, and before I was like, well, we could do better. Now it's like, oh my God, we actually literally might be on a Titanic. Holy fucking shit. And this gets to, and I can't control people. I hate that. But it is the case that if you have something that can make sense out of a lot of shit and help people with a meaning and mental health crisis, and if the meaning and mental health crisis, at the very least, I mean, shit, Nick and everybody, there's many people that are suffering in ways that make my heart weep. And if we could sit with our affect and love each other and know how to feed each other's souls in a much more, and like the way the Oral Indigenous people figured out, holy shit, that'd be so many more people would be having better lives, and many less people be opioid addicted or wanting to kill themselves. We can definitely do better, not to mention the planet, right? Okay. So what does that mean? It means I got to sync up. That's happening. Then we need help. That's why you need these kinds of conversations. And then other people need to say, all right, Greg did his artistic thing with this thing. That's what I did. I did my own scientific, humanistic, artistic, built my own goddamn religion for myself. That's what I did. It's like, and now I love it. I'm super. I'm a happy goddamn camper. I pray to my tree. I sit under my tree, and I'm all, but who the fuck can metabolize that, right? Other than me. It's like, that's my religion. So now other people need to be like, well, how do we actually make sense of this so a normal person can be developed, TOK for dummies, it's a normal person music. You're like, oh, it's kind of complicated from him, but for me, I can tell you, actually, when you start talking, you're actually justifying your actions. Okay. And that's kind of cool, because actually you think you're just saying what's logical, but actually you're motivated in a particular way. And you actually listen to your enemies as though they're justifying. That's why you always think they're bullshitting, but you're blind to your own justification process. You think you're telling the truth. Isn't that kind of cool that you actually work that way? If people that are open and capable to hear that, actually, they'll pop and they'll go, oh my God, I actually do that. It's like, yeah, I actually do.
Like
Okay,
their own
cool. You know?
Individual developmental joint point.
That's right. That's right. And then you shift on that. And I believe modernists were trying to find transcendent justifications as if there was one foundational truth. Actually, we're integrated pluralistics. You know, it's like everyone's going to have, that's what the postmodern critique tells you. Actually, yes, there's an imminent position and perspectival. That's not, there's no the truth, but there's an integrated pluralistic dialectic that postmodernists deconstruct it way too much. You hold both in proper tension. And that's obvious. You go back to the wisdom traditions, they got that fucking years ago. So we can recover that, I think. And the point of it is you need somebody that actually sees its brilliance. You need a group of people to get behind it, and then we need to metabolize it so that other people can actually participate in it without all of the highfalutin academic layering bullshit that I put onto the thing, which I needed to do. I don't. People say, why don't you make it simple? It's like, I'm in the bowels of our philosophical and scientific understanding across all of these different perspectives. I can't then make it so that my neighbor gets it with ease and then can decipher what with nuance if somebody else comes along and say, I don't get it that way. All of a sudden he's going to be able to decipher where the other guy is, what he's got wrong, what he has right, and make it right. No, that's a totally different set of problems, you know? So we're at that place now. Now we got to get it back into what is a accessible spot, and other people who are much more marketing savvy and familiar with the system and know how to make that bridge need to be part of the process.
What you've created here is like, no, I definitely just lost the train of thought there on that, but it's, well, I guess we'll save that for another talk then.
Yeah,
Totally,
right. So,
it was good though.
well, that's good. We'll metabolize this. It's been a good 2 hours.
You've created technology. I don't know how my computer works, but I know how to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't necessarily need to know every little point of the theory of knowledge to be able to use it.
That's right. That's right.
So
that's exactly. So then how does it turn into knowledge technology, psychotechnology? That's it, to use the for people that actually are locate them in their zone of proximal development and what their pragmatic needs are. And yeah, it's a wealth of it. That's why I'm a good therapist. Somebody comes to me, as long as I locate them where they are, I have all these tools that can be like, oh, this can help. And 9 times out of 10, people are like, damn, I wish I'd known that before.
all about meeting them where they're at.
Yep. All righty.
Cool.
Hey, man, this was a lot of fun. We'll find another time.
Let's do it.
So, all right. Well, we'll continue our conversations on the list, and we'll now starting the dialogos of the UTOC and TOK and all that good stuff. All right, guys.
Yeah.
Hey, man.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great questions. Lots of fun.
Thanks to you.
All right.
Bye.
Guys. Take
Bye,
care.
guys.
Yep.